Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Touching Down with the Fraser Estuary, Exploring How Threats to Coastal Wetlands Impact Western Sandpipers Across the Americas. Migratory birds connect us with their unique songs and flights and remind us the importance of working together across borders to protect them. In this webinar, we will be talking about one of the most important wetlands in the Pacific Flyway, especially for three species of shorebirds, the western sandpiper, Dunlin, and the black-bellied plover. I'm very pleased that all of you are joining us in this webinar, where our wonderful presenters, James Cassey and Borja Heredia, will talk about the main threats that these species encounter in the Fraser Estuary and explore some solutions that require connecting across borders and a vision of shorebird conservation from an international perspective. Before we begin, I would like to give you some general indications. At the bottom of your screens, you will find the Q&A box. Please place there your questions that will be answered by our panelists once the presentations are over. This webinar is being recorded, so in the next weeks, we'll be sharing with you this recording. And having said this, I would now like to welcome our first speaker, James Cassey. Thanks, James, for joining us. James, after earning a master's degree in international environmental policy at the University of Northern British Columbia, James had the opportunity to work with WWF Canada on topics ranging from eelgrass and marine planning to hydropower and the Water Sustainability Act. This experience established a base of knowledge he is now applying to the context of the Fraser Estuary key biodiversity area. On behalf of Birds Canada, James is building support for the development of a Fraser River Estuary management plan for this KBA. James will be letting us know about the wonders of the Fraser Delta, as well as the challenges Western sandpipers face. Thanks, James, again, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Maria. Can I get a thumbs up if the volume's coming through? Looking good? Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks again to BirdLife for making this event possible on World Migratory Bird Day. And also I wanted to thank a few partners in the Canadian IBA program. So I'll be presenting today on about the work of a number of parties. In particular, Nature Canada is our IBA partner in Canada. And so they've been a great help in the Fraser Delta, as well as locally BC Nature has been an important player in helping maintain the health of the Delta. And then I would like to call out also the research work of two researchers within Environment and Climate Change Canada, Bob Elner and Mark Drever, who I'll be referencing a lot in this presentation. And it's through their work that we have learned so much about how important the Delta is to Western sandpipers. So thanks to a large number of people that contribute to protecting this place. And with that, we'll get into where this place is. So we're talking today about the Fraser River Delta, key biodiversity area. So it's this area outlined in orange. It's located on the western...
I'm sorry, James, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh, thank you. Pull that up. Did that come up now?
It's, oh,
yep.
That's right. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. So it's this area outlined in orange. It's located on the west coast of North America, right at the very westernmost part of Canada, right at the US-Canada border. It's at the mouth of Western Canada's largest river. It drains roughly a third of the province of British Columbia. It's located on the untraditional and unceded territories of the Halkmene-speaking people who have lived there since time immemorial. And some of the communities of the Coast Salish that are located on the Delta include Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Tawasin and Semiahmo's people. And they have coexisted with the delta as the delta has evolved over eons, with this large river system depositing tons and tons of sediment and slowly building a delta front that is now Western Canada's largest delta. The large amount of discharge, freshwater discharge from the river, also acts as a massive pump, pulling marine water into the Salish Sea region, which is the marine part of this environment. And with that marine water comes very nutrient-rich waters that lead to the incredible productivity of the place, supporting millions of birds, and at least globally or nationally significant abundances of 24 different bird species. So it's a pretty remarkable place to visit, and that's been acknowledged internationally. So the site has been designated as a Ramsar, or a large part of the delta has been designated as a Ramsar wetland of international importance. It also has been designated a Western Hemisphere shorebird reserve network site of hemispheres important because of the large numbers of Western sandpipers and Dunlin and black-bellied plover that use the area. Today we're going to focus on the Western sandpiper. These little guys are, well, little. They only come in at a few ounces. And one of the comparisons, if you're having a trouble visualizing sort of how much a Western sandpiper might weigh, so they come in at 22 to 35 grams, which is the equivalent of about 2 cherry tomatoes. So I was trying to think of, well, how could I make that comparison? Got out the scale. 2 cherry tomatoes in the palm of your hand is about the weight of a Western sandpiper. And so it's these tiny little birds I now kind of think as being a bit puffy, because they're quite bright white, and they have that nice white coloring. By the time they get to the Fraser Delta, they're in their breeding plumage, and they've got that nice pure white underbelly, and then rufous and gray and black streaking in the heads. And being so small, I don't know, for some reason I've started to think of them as somewhat puffy. They overwinter mostly in Mexico and Central Americas, going as far down as some being found in Peru and sort of that part of South America. And then they breed up in the Arctic tundra. So they make this very long annual migration every year. And by the time they get to the Delta, they have started to aggregate into large flocks. So unlike other birds, which may make the migration as individual birds, the Western sandpipers start to aggregate around as they leave the Bay of Panama, and they start building into these larger and larger flocks at some of the key stopover sites along the flyway. And so they undertake this spring flocking behavior, and then by the time they get to the Fraser Delta, they're in these large congregations that kind of range in size around 20 to 50,000 birds in a flock, and undertake these amazing murmurations on the Delta. And so you have these lovely aerial displays of black and white transformation as they move synchronously over the waters. And so it's really an amazing sight and an awesome spectacle to behold. But the migration is powered by only a few kind of really key stopover sites along the way. So like I said, the Bay of Panama, I can't never say it, the Ojo Lagoon, the Negro Lagoon, the San Francisco Bay, Grays Harbor, the Fraser Delta, and then finally before the last major stop, Copper River Delta, before going out to the breeding grounds. And when they reach the Fraser Delta, you have about 90% of the population as aggregated into these large flocking behavior. And so one site in particular, the one pictured here, is known as Brunswick Point and it's a mud flat in the Fraser Estuary that supports somewhere in the range of 30 to 60% of the population on any given year. And so you can see all those little tiny dots in the image here. And these are Western sandpipers feeding on the mud flats. And it was discovered that what they're actually doing here is, it was discovered by Dr. Bob Elner, who we mentioned, and his colleagues, that they're using their specially evolved tongues, which are made of this very rough kind of almost Velcro-like substance, to split biofilm, which is a thin kind of gooey mud or very gooey element off of the surface of the mud. And so this question was, well, what was so important about biofilm, and why were so many of the Western sandpipers using this mudflat habitat emerged? And what were the risks associated with that aggregation, and what would we need to do to maintain that mudflat habitat? So in the Delta, two really large threats have emerged in recent history. So over time, we've lost roughly 80% of our functional coastal wetland habitat to other development, to agriculture, to water use management. But currently, as it stands, the two emerging threats to the coastal wetland habitat in the Delta are shipping development and climate change, and mostly sea level rise. So the main driver for our shipping development is a global economic pivot to increasing trade with Asia. And of course, the main driver to sea level rise is global consumption of fossil fuels relating to increased carbon emissions and temperature rise. So these would be the two main threats on the Delta that really the Western sandpipers are faced with. In terms of sea level rise, the mechanism through which this happens is something known as coastal squeeze. And so the Fraser Delta is a settled area. There's agricultural lands. There's millions of people that live in the region. And all of that is protected by roughly 500 kilometers of diking infrastructure. And so as the sea level rises, it's exposing these communities to risk of flooding, and their response is to raise the seawalls, the diking infrastructure around them. The problem with that is that it's leading to the loss of that intertidal coastal habitat, both the mud flats and the marsh habitat above it. And so you get this response that is known as coastal squeeze that communities are having to deal with. And the question is, how do we maintain the productivity of this intertidal coastal habitat? And so right now there's projects being proposed on the Delta looking at sediment augmentation, where we're taking sediment that's coming out of the river and putting it onto the Delta front to try and raise the sediment levels as sea levels rise, and thereby having a relationship where as we potentially rise the dike, we can also raise the mud flats and the marsh habitat in front of it. So that's one issue that's playing out. We're not exactly sure how that's going to impact the productivity of these mud flats for shorebirds, and that's, I think, a question that we have to look into as these investments are being made. And these are large scale projects. So the adaptation projects that are ranging in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars kind of investments. And so people are really taking a hard look at whether other options such as managed retreat could be on the table. That hasn't come through in terms of a commitment yet, but it's really requiring a sober second look of how we live on the Delta. But even as we're sort of reflecting on how we're using the Delta and our interactions with that coastal front due to sea level rise, the government of Canada, like I said, has this vision of increasing trade to our Asian counterparts through what they're calling gateways of Prince Rupert and Vancouver. So we're seeing billions of dollars being invested in infrastructure on the Delta. And that's everything from road and rail infrastructure, apologies, to port infrastructure on the coast and supporting container storage facilities such as Amazon shipping container storage and that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of infrastructure associated with improving the gateway ability to move goods through the Delta. One of the projects we're particularly concerned about at this point is something known as Roberts Bank Terminal 2. It's being proposed at Brunswick Point, which is where that picture of the Western Sandpipers are shown. It's represented by this red rectangle here. And what it risks doing is changing the flow of the water coming out of the Fraser. And by redirecting the flow of fresh water, it also changes the salinity on that mud flat. And so in some areas, it'll decrease the salinity, and in some areas, it'll increase the salinity. And why that is of concern to Western Sandpipers is because by changing the salinity, we're also actually changing the composition of what are known as long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids in this biofilm that we spoke about earlier. So as we pointed out, the Roberts Banks has these large aggregations of Western Sandpipers that we've learned come there to feed with their specially adapted tongues on this substance called biofilm. And the question was, why were they feeding on this biofilm? And it turns out that it was because these biofilm was so rich in these polyunsaturated fatty acids that are important to their ability to make these long distance migrations. And by changing the salinity on the mud flats, there's concerns that it will also change the ability of this biofilm to produce these fatty acids in the first place, because the production or the amount of the fatty acids in the biofilm is linked to triggers such as salinity, temperature, and other dynamic factors. And so out of concern about these impacts on the biofilm, experts at Environment and Climate Change Canada determined that the Roberts Bank 2 project, as currently designed, would pose a permanent, unmitigatable species level risk to Western Sandpipers. So we have this interface of a dynamic discharge from the river, the rising sea levels, and port infrastructure changing how the water flows across the Delta. And I think in that are some important lessons for the flyway. So for one, stopover sites such as the Fraser Estuary are so critical because they, to the birds across the Americas, our shorebirds across the Americas, because they support such high densities of birds. And these high density of birds are reliant on the productivity of essential fatty acids to power their migration. So that's sort of a site-specific learning that I think applies all along the flyway. We are seeing the impacts of sea level rise at every location. And at a number of the stopover sites, we're also seeing the impact of that push to increase trade with Asia that are resulting in more development along our coastal wetlands. So some tangible solutions, I think, for us to consider. We at Birds Canada think that the government of Canada needs to reject the proposed Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project, at least as currently designed, and implement a Fraser Estuary management plan, which is currently missing for this area. It would be great if within that estuary management plan, the Brunswick Point habitat and mudflats was giving meaningful protection to maintain the function of that relationship between the river and the biofilm. Stepping up a scale, I think at the flyway scale, we we are all faced with a challenge of how do we adapt to rising sea level rise. We have a couple of projects in the Fraser Delta that could be an interesting opportunity to learn from. If we're applying sediment and augmenting the banks and raising them, what does that mean? What impact or benefit does that have for shorebirds? We're not sure. I think we can learn a lot from this kind of site level experimentation, but we could use a platform to share across the flyway lessons learned in terms of what's working and what's not. I think the migratory bird conventions or other sort of trans-boundary conventions can help us with that platform of cross-country learning, cross-site learning. I think it's really important that the Migratory Bird Project, which is monitoring shorebirds across the flyway, continue and be part of that conversation and look at how adaptation is influencing those populations. And then I think the shipping sector needs to be engaged as well. And so one option is on the West Coast, there's a sustainability standard known as Green Marine that a number of the shipping actors subscribe to. Unfortunately, Green Marine doesn't currently consider birds or bird habitat in their certification process. And so there may be an opportunity to engage the industry and talk about how do they adjust their practices to give consideration to the important bird habitats that they are impacting. And so the Pacific America's Shorebird Conservation Strategy has definitely identified a number of these actions as the step in the right direction. But I'm interested in hearing from Borja about how the international conventions may help strengthen some of those steps. And with that, I think I will thank everyone again for the amazing work and the opportunity to speak today about Western Sandpipers and turn it back to Maria.
Thanks a lot, James. That was a very insightful presentation. Don't forget, if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A box, and James will address them at the end of the next presentation. So now I would like to introduce our next guest, Borja Heredia. Thanks for joining us, Borja. He has worked at the Spanish Ministry of Environment since 1986, focusing on the conservation of threatened species, planning research, drawing up strategies, and organizing projects in the field. Borja has been involved in the conservation of several CMS species. From 92 to 95, he worked for BirdLife International in Cambridge, developing action plans for globally threatened birds in Europe. And in 2010, he started working at the CMS Secretariat, where he dealt with a number of cross-cutting issues, such as climate change and wildlife diseases. Together with FAO, he was co-convener of the Task Force on Wildlife and Ecosystem Health that was created at the CMS Conference of the Parties in 2011. In 2013, he was appointed as head of the avian species team, where he dealt with different birds instruments under the CMS and promoted the World Migratory Bird Day that we are celebrating with this webinar. He was instrumental for the adoption of the America's Flyways Framework and Action Plan, and since 2019, he's back in Spain working for the Ministry of Ecological Transition. Thanks a lot, Borja, for joining us, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, for your introduction, and hello to everybody participating. Okay, so I will start sharing my screen.
Yeah, James, if you could stop sharing your screen so Borja can share his, please. Thanks.
Okay. There we go. And now we put it on presentation mode. There you go. Okay, so I found James' presentation really fascinating, especially the discoveries on the biofilm and the fatty acids, the PUFA, and how this affects the migration of the western sandpiper. This is really amazing what you can learn from this research. And okay, so following that, I will try to give you a kind of an overview of some international initiatives that have to do with flyways, and how they can be used for the benefit of sites. Let me just start remembering the definition of a flyway. So a flyway is the entire range of a migratory bird through which it moves on an annual basis, from breeding to non-breeding grounds, including resting, feeding, and other stopover places, as well as the areas within which the birds migrate. So the flyways are really the avenues that birds are using on the migratory travels. Also very important in the flyway definition, a very important element are the site networks. So basically, birds that migrate in a kind of an arrow front pattern, jumping from one side to the other and looking for the habitats that they need to rest and feed along the migrations. And this is the case of the shorebirds. A very important element of the flyway approach is the creation of well-connected networks of good quality places, that ensuring that the birds can travel safely from one area to the other. So flyway's approach includes this component of the site network, and these sites have to be well connected in the sense that barriers to migration have to be avoided so that the birds can travel from one patch to the other. And this is really key concept, because we can be very good at protecting one site, one patch, but if the other key sites along the flyway are not adequately protected, the whole system will collapse. And we have seen this happen already. So just a couple of words about shorebirds in particular. Shorebirds are one of the most threatened groups of migratory birds in the world, and some of them are declining sharply. They are very highly site faithful and depend on key stopover, breeding, and wintering sites. Shorebirds are sentinels of coastal ecosystem health, and they need a full flyway approach for conservation. So it is a very good example of a group of birds, migratory birds, that need this flyway approach for conservation. So let's go now to the different policy instruments that in a way incorporate the flyway approach to management. I will mention first of all the Convention of Biological Diversity, the CBD, and in particular the Caring for Coasts initiative under the CBD, which is very, very relevant for migratory birds, and also the proposal to create a global coastal forum. So CBD is addressing directly the issue of coastal wetlands and flyways. Very important is the Ramsar Convention of Wetlands, and in particular, the obligation of countries to designate sites of international importance for birds and other species. In the North Americas, we have a very senior treaty, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, more than 100 years old, to deal with conservation of migratory birds. Very relevant policy instrument. Changing flyway and moving to the East Asian Australasian flyway, we have the partnership there for this flyway, which is a very interesting arrangement as well, involving all the countries along the East Asian Australasian flyway. Another interesting initiative and relevant is the Arctic Migratory Birds Initiative, which is managed by the Arctic Council, which are the countries around the Arctic. And the fact that, you know, Arctic countries, they consider that they cannot just focus on the breeding areas of the shorebirds, but they have to take into account migration areas and non-breeding and wintering areas if they want to succeed in the protection of the Arctic breeding birds. So just a few initiatives, and I leave for the end the one that is somehow closer to my heart, because I worked at the Secretariat of the Convention on Migratory Species for several years in Bonn. So this is the one that I know better. And CMS is an international treaty that operates under the UN system. The members of CMS are governments from the countries that signed the convention. These are the contracting parties of the convention. And at present, there are 132 countries that have ratified, and in particular, 13 countries in the Americas that are parties to the CMS. The interesting thing about the CMS is that it provides a legal framework to develop a variety of conservation instruments according to the needs of the species or groups of species concerned. These instruments can range from legally binding agreements, as we will see, and softer memoranda of understanding, MOUs, but also other initiatives, frameworks, action plans, etc. So there is a lot of flexibility within CMS to choose the better approach for the region and for the group of species that we are targeting. Just to name a few examples, there are a couple of agreements which have to do with birds under the CMS. One is for the albatrosses and petrels. This is called ACAP in the Southern Ocean. And the other one is the Agreement for Conservation of African Eurasian Waterbirds. So agreements are very strong instruments in the sense that they are legally binding, and countries that join these agreements have to provide funding for the functioning of the agreement. So they have a funding mechanism which is very important for conservation. So these two agreements, ACAP and AEWA, they are considered as very successful and useful tools for the kind of birds that they target. The other instrument that is also interesting is the Memoranda of Understanding, the MOUs. It is a softer approach, it's non-legally binding, but also easier for countries to engage with this kind of more flexible instruments. So under the CMS, we have an MOU for African Eurasian raptors with a secretariat based in Abu Dhabi. We have another MOU for the high Andean flamingos. and a third MOU for the southern South America grassland birds, so-called grassland birds. MOU also considered a quite successful tool for the conservation of these grassland birds. So stronger approach, the agreements, softer approach, but equally efficient, the MOUs. In addition to these instruments, the CMS celebrates a Conference of the Parties every 3 years and adopts resolutions. So I would like to mention the resolution on the conservation of coastal, intertidal, and other coastal habitats for migratory species, which calls on countries to enhance their efforts to conserve and promote sustainable use of intertidal wetlands and other coastal habitats of importance for migratory species. So we can see here a very strong synergy with the CBD resolution and initiative on caring for coasts and Global Coastal Forum. So this is very positive to see two different conventions really working along the same direction and focusing on the key priorities. And especially targeting the Americas, there is another instrument under the CMS, a more, general, broad instrument called the Americas Flyways Framework, which is provided to assist governments and non-profit organizations, scientists, corporations, etc., to the conservation of migratory birds in the Western Hemisphere. This is a very, very relevant instrument which provides a framework to develop MOUs or other instruments in the Americas. I forgot to say before, when talking about the MOUs, that you don't have to be a party to CMS to engage in an MOU. So this gives a greater flexibility for countries which are non-parties to CMS to develop, for example, in the Americas, shorebirds MOU. This would be perfectly possible, even if the countries are non-parties. So just mention rapidly the 5 pillars of the Americas Flyways Framework. First one is mainstreaming biodiversity, which is very much in line with CBD priorities as well. Second one is addressing the direct pressures and threats on migratory birds. Third one is the issue of safeguarding species, ecosystem, and critical habitats, very much in line with the site networks that we mentioned before. Fourth one is to enhance the ecosystem services that migratory birds provide. And final one, but very important, it's about knowledge management, research, and capacity building. So in addition to these instruments and opportunities that we can find in the international conventions, there are still many problems to be solved and addressed in the flyways of the world. Looking about the coastal sites, quite a repetitive problem that we find is the fragmentation of the coastal governance, which can happen between marine and terrestrial administrations or between different levels of state, regional, and local administrations. So very often in these coastal areas, we have to go to a kind of co-governance approach to the management of the sites, which is a very important issue. I would mention also the lack of enough international cooperation, especially in situations of economic crisis, as we have lived some years ago. countries are a little bit reluctant to engage in international cooperation and tend to focus more on their national priorities, which is not good for the flyway approach. Of course, as James has mentioned already, we have pressures from industry in different ways, and agriculture. Agriculture is really becoming a very, very important threat to biodiversity globally, and there is, intensification of agriculture is happening everywhere in the world, and is having a strong impact on some migratory birds. We have a very big impetus now on renewable energies, wind farms, which can be inshore or offshore, and other kind of man-made structures which are responsible for mortality for migratory birds due to electrocution, collisions, etc. So we have to be clear, we are not against the renewable energy, but not at any cost. We have to be very careful where we put these installations to avoid the impact on biodiversity. In Spain, for example, we're witnessing now a huge increase in solar farms because we have lots of sun here in Spain. But these infrastructures can have a very, very big impact as well, and they cannot be just set up anywhere. I guess you will agree that funding is a key priority, and I have been reading a little bit about Fraser River Estuary to prepare for this webinar, and I saw that there is an estimate to protect about 100 key species in the estuary. Around 15 million Canadian dollars a year would be necessary, to avoid the extinction of these 100 species. So this kind of funding is essential, really, and we have to look for imaginative solutions, public-private partnerships, different alternatives to cope with the problem of funding. And of course, as has been said already very eloquently by James, climate change is the overarching threat. The huge changes in the ecology of these sites that will force birds to adapt or just simply move to another place if they can. So just some problems that we have to keep in mind for bird conservation, but just not to be completely negative. Let me mention some positive developments that we are witnessing. For example, the designation of UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the Yellow Sea region in the East Asian Australasian Flyway. This is really, breaking news. The designation of these World Heritage Sites, which are preventing large-scale reclamation of key coastal areas for migratory shorebirds. And we have some critically endangered species in that flyway, like the endangered spoon-billed sandpiper. Another example of implementation of UNESCO World Heritage Sites is in the Wadden Sea. This is at the heart of Europe, a huge coastal area and mudflat area shared between Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, which have set up a trilateral secretariat to manage internationally this huge area for migratory birds. So let's keep in mind this instrument of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, because they can be applied to many other areas in the world and prevent risks like the ones that James was mentioning in his presentation about Fraser River. Let me just finish in a positive way, in a positive mood, just to celebrate a very important event, which was the get together of the International Migratory Bird Day campaign and the World Migratory Bird Day campaign, the two most important campaigns for conservation of migratory birds. First one focusing more on the Americas, second one focusing more in Europe. But under the direction of CMS, these two very important campaigns got together and signed a partnership agreement in 2017, and thus creating the largest global campaign to raise awareness about migratory bird conservation. So let's enjoy World Migratory Bird Day that we are celebrating in a few days in May, and let's take the opportunity to enjoy the wonderful spectacle of migratory birds, which is something that will always impress us and really touch our hearts. With this good news about this partnership agreement, I will finish and hand over to Maria. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Borja, for that presentation. I keep with the importance and urgence of strengthening international approach if we want to protect migratory birds. So I would like to turn to the questions from the audience now. We have a couple of questions. Don't forget, if you have any doubts, put in a Q&A box. James Barnett has a question about in what stage of decision making is the port development and what are the options, also time-wise, to advocate for a less damaging alternative. Right,
thanks. So the port project is currently in the environmental assessment process. In Canada, it's now known as the impact assessment process. They have paused that process as Canada has asked for more information on how to mitigate the impacts identified by an independent panel report. And so the port is very close to submitting a package on their proposed mitigation actions in terms of the impacts on southern resident killer whales and salmon species, as well as they'll be providing some more information on how they anticipate mitigating the impacts on the biofilm that is present at Brunswick Point. Once that has been submitted, then the community has 90 days to review that information, and the government of Canada has time to review that, 90 days to review that information and make a decision on whether the project can be justified. So the review of the mitigation options is an important next step. That if anybody out there has expertise in biofilm and shorebirds, we'd really appreciate help reviewing that, because it's going to be a very difficult and technical process to look at that. And then there's this bigger question about whether the development can be justified. So the government of Canada is going to have to weigh the benefits for the economy against some of the social and environmental impacts. Western Sandpiper being one, but there are numerous other negative impacts with a project of this scale. And at the same time, there are other proposed container terminals, both out of the Vancouver area and also on other parts of the BC coast that are competing for this approval and funding and a desire to proceed. So there are alternatives on the table, just not being considered within this process. So yeah, the timing is now in terms of saying there are other alternatives, and the technical work is kind of ongoing.
Thanks a lot, James. We have another question for both of our presenters. Andres Iglesias is asking, well, he says, we know that in coastal zones, many human activities converge. Can you suggest some compatible and incompatible human activities for the conservation of shorebirds in terms of territorial planning for coastal areas?
I think I can have a go at this one. I would say that activities like, for example, sustainable tourism can be fully compatible with the conservation of these sites if properly organized, which is something possible. And very, very beneficial, especially in these wetland sites which are close to big metropolis. And talking about some incompatible human activities, I would think about those activities that are affecting the functioning of the ecosystem in general. I could mention, for example, intensification of agriculture in these areas, or growing berries or strawberries, and pumping water from the underground at levels which are not sustainable for the site. Just as an example. I'm sure James can mention many others.
Yeah, I would, if that's okay, I wouldn't mind a couple ideas there. I totally agree in terms of projects that, if we were to approach the question from what impact the function and productivity of the estuary, that can give you some indications about which projects would be acceptable and what not. I would say projects that result in hard surfaces or hard barriers to the flow of water or nutrients would probably be unacceptable for shorebirds. And so, as an example, Borja had mentioned agriculture. The Delta is a really important overwintering site for western sand, or for Dunlin, another species of shorebirds. And they use both the intertidal for foraging and also the farmers' fields for foraging. And that agricultural practice can coexist when the farmers respect and are implement best management practices that provide food for shorebirds and other bird species. But when we get an intensification of agriculture, and one of the issues in the Delta is the introduction of greenhouses, because that allows you to grow all year round and control the environment. And that hardening of that agricultural landscape means it's no longer accessible to birds to forage, and therefore would be incompatible with maintaining the site. On a comparable impact in terms of like ecotourism, we talk about ecotourism, it can be beneficial, but when we start to introduce hotels and parking lots and things that harden that coastal wetland and reduce the productivity, then it starts to become incompatible. So we really have to look at maintaining that function and productivity through softer approaches to development that allow nature to flow and be dynamic in a way that produces food for the birds.
Great, thank you guys. Next question, would you consider a national marine conservation area to protect the area long-term, and how should we go about protecting our biodiversity in the estuary?
Thanks. I think that's the Canadian Pacific question. So the national, so yes, the tool identified makes sense. One of the challenges in Canada is that a number of our protected area tools don't address the industrial threat, so they still allow industrial activities within a protected area boundary, or they don't address the issue of boundary effects. So a number of our sites are have site-specific designations, but then there is something that happens right outside the boundary that interrupt the ecological function, so that we see a reduction of health inside the protected area. So definitely site-specific tools such as the National Marine Conservation Area, I think I got that right, sorry, is an option, but we need planning for outside of those protected areas as well. So that's where this governance issue and management plan become important. We need a vision for the area that includes the thriving of birds and biodiversity, and then protection becomes one of the tools, but so does sustainable management of industrial activities.
Great. Thanks a lot, James, for your answer. Also, Borja, and thank all of you for your questions. Due to time constraints, the remaining questions will be answered by email in the following days. And so I'll be sharing with our panelists the questions that remain left. And as a final point, and to close this webinar, I would like to give the floor to the director of the BirdLife Americas office, Ian. Thanks a lot. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabby, so much, and thank you for both presenters. I would say very different but very complementary presentations. One very focused on a critical flyway site, and another one about conventions that try to link efforts and impact efforts across sites. And just really quickly, sort of take away 3 or 4 messages. The first, that pressures at the local level obviously have impacts at the global level, and the Fraser River Delta is an example of that with western sandpipers, that whatever happens there is going to impact those species across their entire flyway from Alaska down to Panama. The other issue is around flyways, and I'm heartened to see that the Pacific Flyway Conservation Plan is there to coordinate efforts, to help coordinate efforts, if you will, across the flyways from Alaska right down to Chile. And I know you're part of that, James. I know that Birds Canada is an active member of that, and it's really important to be working along flyways with governments, NGOs, private sector partners, and academic institutions. And then, Borja, you reminded us that conventions are really important instruments, and the CMS being one of those. And even though Canada hasn't ratified the convention per se, there are instruments like the MOUs that can be used, and there's much more that we can say about that. And I would close by saying that, Borja, you reminded us that we also need to celebrate, and I know that Birds Canada and Nature Canada, our BirdLife partners in Canada, have been actively celebrating the fact that Fraser River Delta is such an important site, and unless we sort of act together along locally and along the flyways, that we may indeed lose this really important site for migratory shorebirds. I hope that's not the case. And James, I hope that you'll keep us apprised of what's happening in Fraser River Delta, and let us know how we can support you from the BirdLife perspective. Again, thank you, both of you, for your talk today. And Gabby, thank you for managing from Quito to pull this all together. It was a great couple of presentations, and I'll look forward to following up with all of you. If there's any other questions, please send to either one of our presenters or Gabby, and we will definitely follow up. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, and happy World Migratory Birthday. Bye.
Thank you.